He had spent countless nights picturing a fragile woman stepping off that wagon, someone small enough to fit into the quiet corners of his lonely life. But when the dust settled, what he saw instead was a towering figure with shoulders broad enough to carry burdens heavier than his own heartache. In that single breath, his dreams of delicate hands and whispered words were replaced by the startling truth of reality. Love doesn't always come wrapped in the shape you expect. Sometimes, it arrives in a form that challenges everything you believe about yourself. Before we begin this story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? And what time of day is it right now, late afternoon? The dust of the frontier road hung in a copper haze over the town's main street, turning the sunlight into a slow drifting veil. Wagon wheels creaked like old bones. Harness rings chimed. A shutter banged against sun-baked clapboards. The smell of horse sweat, pitch from the livery's timbers, and a faint ribbon of coffee from the boarding house kitchen mingled on the dry wind. Elias Boone stood by the hitch rail with a splinter in his palm and a tremor in his chest, feeling that small splinter, that small tremor, as if they were a private weather only he could feel. He had imagined a slight figure stepping down someone whose hands would fit inside his, who would lay a soft palm on the sill and remark on the neatness of the onion rows. He had imagined lace at the throat, a laugh like water, a voice to stitch seams across his empty evenings. But when the teamster hauled on his brake and the wagon sighed to a stop, the dust parted and revealed a woman whose shadow reached the toes of his boots. Tallulah Hayes rose from the backboard like a pillar hewn from mountain grain, 6 feet in her worn boots and broad across the shoulders, her traveling skirt brushing her shins like a tide. Her hands, gloved but unmistakably strong, caught the wagon's edge. She stepped down with the steadiness of someone who trusted her own weight. A stray strand of dark hair clung to her temple in the heat. Her eyes, gray as river stones, scanned the yard and found him small, thin-shouldered. Hat brim tugged low as if modesty could make a man taller. The letter in Elias's vest pocket felt suddenly like a joke told too loud. The wooden ring box he had carried for weeks grew heavier in a way that had nothing to do with Oak. Somewhere behind him, someone coughed to smother a laugh. Boots shuffled a semicircle. The town had turned the day into a stage. He heard the soft tisk of Mrs. Henderson from the general store and the dry rasp of the blacksmith's file stopping mid-stroke. A boy darted from the boardwalk and stretched his arms wide in pantomime. His mother hissed his name and snatched him back. Barnaby Pike, the teamster who hauled freight and gossip in equal measure, hopped down from the driver's bench and scraped his hat brim across his thigh. "Miss Hayes," he said, throat clearing, eyes slipping from Elias to her and back again. "Mr. Boone." He lifted a trunk that seemed to have more geography in it than most folks' lives and set it on the ground with a grunt that gave the crowd the satisfaction of a noise. Tallulah's chin dipped in a greeting. For a heartbeat, the certainty in her posture loosened. It wasn't fear, exactly, but the quick flicker of someone who knows the room has shifted around her. "Mr. Boone," she said, voice low as worn leather, not unkind. She held out her hand, and Elias found his own swallowed whole, his knuckles careful inside her care. Heat licked the back of his neck. He managed. "Miss Hayes," and the effort of it felt like lifting a gate against the wind. "Would you?" he started, but the sentence scattered like chaff. He tried again. "It's a short walk to the place," he said, gesturing toward the ridge-backed road that led out to his claim. His mouth was dust-dry. The pump handle at the corner winked in the sun. "Water first," Tallulah suggested, and her gaze slid toward the iron pitcher sweating on the boarding house porch. They crossed the street, boards hot underfoot, grit skittering under heels. The pump handle moaned, and the first pour ran rust-red, then cleared. Elias filled a tin cup and passed it to her. When their fingers touched along the rim, he felt callus against callus his finer, her coarser like two different kinds of work shaking hands. She drank without daintiness, water slipping a clean line along her throat. He drank after her, tasting iron and something like steadiness. The crowd frayed and pretended to become errands. A sunburned man produced a stub of pencil to make urgent notes on a shipping crate. 2 women inspected apples as if each bruise were a scripture. The boy who had made his arms into a joke crouched at wheel height, peering sideways. "How long was your ride?" Elias asked, because a man must fill the air or choke on it. 8 days that felt like 14, she said, mouth quirking. Wind at our backs only when we'd rather not have it. He noticed the edge of a handkerchief tucked into her bodice, tiny blue flowers stitched along the corner. Thread faded, stitches tidy and earnest. She caught his glance and, for a strangled instant, something tender and old flashed across her face, then sealed itself away. The smell of sun-warmed cotton and road dust clung to her like a map of every mile she'd endured. Barnaby hoisted the trunk again, and they set out, leaving the town's pressed curiosity to settle behind them. The road to Elias's place cut between mule's ear and brittle sage, the heat ringing like an unseen anvil. Grasshoppers zipped from their steps in startled clicks. Hawks traced slow loops above the ridge, their shadows sliding like secrets. "It's not much," Elias said, before the cabin even came into view, a reflex as natural as breathing. "It's a start," Tallulah answered, and her tone made the words sound like a kind of blessing. His cabin sat square on the land, scrubbed by wind. The porch a bit crooked where frost heave had lifted one post and time had politely left it. The vegetable patch lay stitched in ruler-straight rows, onions spearing green, beans climbing twine like stubborn children. The corral fence showed its age in 2 places where rails had weathered to driftwood and hope. The smell of cut wood hung by the chopping block. The lard tin on the steps held violets a neighbor girl once brought, now brittle and gray but still shaped like kindness. Tallulah didn't wrinkle her nose. She walked the fence line with a cattlewoman's eye, dragging her gloved fingers lightly along the top rail as if reading a sentence. "North corner," she murmured almost to herself. A post's gone soft at the root. Elias blinked. He'd noticed it too. Swore to fix it after the next payday. Hearing it from her mouth pricked the old pride he'd tried to keep folded under gentleness. "I aim to set it right," he said, then heard his own voice and wished the words had less grit and more grace. They stood on the porch. The door's iron latch was smooth from his hand alone. He opened it, and the cool of shaded pine washed over them lamplight smell, bacon memory, the faint resin ghost of winter kindlings. Inside, his table was scrubbed pale. A single chair. A second. Borrowed. Waiting like a question. He saw the place through her eyes and felt the smallness of his life crowd back into his chest. "I thought you'd be smaller," he blurted, and then the shame of it poured hot into his ears. I thought you'd be taller." Tallulah returned, and for the first time a real smile loosened her features. It tilted her mouth and woke a light in those gray eyes. The room breathed easier. "Letters don't measure people," she said, glancing at the lamp chimney as if its soot could tell the weather. "They measure wishes." Elias's fingers, unbidden, touched the edge of the ring box in his vest. The oak had taken a fine polish under his thumb these last weeks. He knew every curve of it by heart. He imagined the ring inside thin, delicate. The size of hope made a circle and felt a sting behind his ribs that had nothing to do with the splinter in his palm. He swallowed the impulse to open it now and make a fool of both of them. Outside, a gust fretted the porch step and spun a twirl of dust across the yard. Far off, a hammer rang 3 quick notes from the blacksmith shop, the town's heartbeat keeping time. "We should talk," Tallulah said, and the way she said it turned the words from a fence into a door. "We should." Elias agreed, and lifted his hand not to prove anything, not to claim, but simply to offer that human measure between strangers. She took it, her grip firm and careful, and in the quiet contact he felt not humiliation, but recognition. 2 lives meeting at the same low threshold. The day slanted toward evening. Somewhere a meadowlark stitched a clear, bright line through the dusty air. Elias let the door swing wider. "There's coffee," he said, "and bread if it didn't go stale on me." "Stale bread softens fine with coffee," she answered, stepping past him into the cool. The boards creaked under her, the house adjusting to a new weight, as if learning a different weather. They did not sit close. They did not sit far. The silence between them held room enough for who they actually were and who they might yet be. Outside, the wind combed the grass in slow, patient strokes, and the first long shadow of evening laid itself across the onion rows like a promise drawn with a steady hand. Morning broke sharp and bright, with a sky the color of pewter polished by the wind. The Boone Ranch lay still under that cool light corral post silvered with dew. The garden rose damp with last night's mist, smoke curling faint from the chimney as coffee hissed on the stove. Elias Boone stood on the porch with his hands wrapped around a tin cup, the steam prickling his nose, when a bellow split the quiet like a gunshot. The cup nearly slipped from his fingers. He rushed to the fence line. His stomach dropped. Dakota, the massive bull he had bought more from foolish pride than practical need, was gone. A jagged hole yawned in the north corner of the corral, right where Tallulah had noted the soft post the day before. The ground bore the churn of hooves, and dust still hung, marking his path. Elias's heart thudded hard enough to sting. Then he heard her voice. Mrs. Henderson. Her shrill cry carried clear across the valley. He squinted toward the Henderson homestead and saw petals scattering like torn fabric, a shape moving slow and terrible among the flower beds. Dakota, nearly a ton of flesh and horn, stood broadside in her roses, stomping and snorting, his breath sending plumes of dust into the air. By the time Elias grabbed his hat and ran, neighbors were spilling from their porches. Men carried coils of rope, but none dared close the distance. A boy scrambled up a fence post for a better look, his legs shaking with both thrill and fear. Mrs. Henderson herself stood on her steps, her apron flapping like a flag of outrage, yelling, "That monster will pay for every stem he's crushed." Elias stopped at the edge of the crowd, chest heaving. He knew Dakota's temper, knew how the animal's eyes rolled white when anger bloomed. Twice before he'd watched the bull toss fence rails like kindling. But this was worse. The garden, the witnesses, the humiliation, his neighbor's stares pressed against his back like a brand. "You can't rope him from the front," a voice said, low but steady. Tallulah had come up beside him, her expression unreadable, her breath not even quickened by the pace she'd kept. "He'll gore the first man tries." Elias's mouth worked, but no words came. Shame crawled up his throat. He should have fixed that post yesterday. He should have. Something. But his mind was empty, as hollow as the broken corral. Then, without another word, Tallulah stepped past him. Her long strides carried her into the churned dirt of Mrs. Henderson's yard. "Wait, Tallulah!" Elias's voice cracked with panic. He's dangerous when he's like this. But she did not turn. The wind caught her skirt, pressing the fabric against her strong frame. Each step she took was slow, measured, as if the earth itself had set a rhythm. The crowd hushed. Even Mrs. Henderson's tirade faltered to silence. The only sounds left were the thud of Dakota's hooves and the faint whistle of sand scratching across the boards. Tallulah's gaze locked on the bull. Her shoulders did not bow. Her hands were empty, palms open. "Easy, big fella," she murmured, voice low as a lullaby sung through cedar. Elias, straining forward, caught only fragments. "You're not angry. You're only lost. The fence wasn't your fault." Dakota swung his horned head toward her, the muscles in his neck flexing like coiled rope. His breath blasted white. The ground quivered beneath him. Elias felt his knees weaken. He nearly shouted, nearly begged her to stop. But there was something in her calm that pinned his throat shut. Step by step, she closed the distance. 10 feet, 8, 6. The bull's hooves pawed the ground, sending sprays of dirt across the ruined roses. The crowd leaned forward, ready to scatter. Elias's heart pounded as though it wanted to flee his chest. Then it happened. The beast hesitated. His pawing slowed. His ears twitched, angling forward to catch her tone. Tallulah reached her hand out, palm up, fingers steady. Her voice carried the rhythm of stream water over stones. "That's it. You're home now, aren't you? No need to fight." Dakota's head lowered an inch. Another. Dust drifted around them like pale smoke. Then her hand touched his hide just behind the ear, fingers digging into the thick muscle. The bull shuddered, not in rage but in release, and loosed a sound that was almost a sigh. Gasps rippled through the gathered neighbors. A man dropped his rope, the thud echoing like a drumbeat of disbelief. Mrs. Henderson covered her mouth with both hands. "Bring me a lead rope," Tallulah called, her eyes never leaving Dakota's. Her voice carried not command but certainty. Fletcher Knox, The merchant bolted for Elias's barn and came back stumbling, rope trailing behind him like a comet's tail. Tallulah looped it quick, her fingers deft, tying a simple halter. With one tug, she turned, and the bull, once fury incarnate, followed her out of the garden as docile as a child trailing its mother. The crowd parted in reverent silence, hats lifted, mouths slack. Elias stood frozen, awe binding his feet to the dirt. She passed him with Dakota lumbering behind, and in that moment she glanced his way. A smile flickered across her face, not triumph, but kindness, and it hit him harder than the bull ever could. "Fence has a weak post in the north corner," she said gently. "We'll need to fix it before he tries another stroll." Whispers broke out before they'd even cleared the Henderson yard. By noon, word of what she'd done was already spinning through saloon talk, through kitchen gossip, through every mouth that loved a story. The woman who had stepped off the wagon too tall, too strong, too wrong for delicate fantasies had calmed a raging bull with nothing more than her hands and her voice. By evening, a parade of neighbors found excuses to ride past Elias's ranch. Some brought pie, some seed, some hollow words of welcome, but all of them, every last one, came for another look at her, at Tallulah Hayes and Elias, sitting at the edge of his porch with hammer and nails waiting for fence repair, felt a strange, tangled storm inside him, part pride, part shame, part fear of what this woman's presence would stir up in the heart of a town that measured men and women by the wrong scales. The sun sank low, gilding the land in a copper blaze. The air smelled of trampled roses and fresh-cut cedar. Dakota, now roped and settled, flicked his tail lazily in the corral. Elias stared at the horizon, knowing life had just shifted on its hinges, and it was Tallulah who had opened the door. The next morning dawned crisp and pale, with a faint veil of fog draped across the valley floor like a worn quilt. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer carried over the still air, joined by the low rumble of wagons beginning their rounds. But it wasn't the usual rhythm of chores that pressed against Elias Boone's chest. That morning, it was the restless murmur of voices. The town was talking. By the time he led Dakota to water, 3 riders had already passed along the road, tipping their hats in exaggerated politeness before nudging their horses faster, as if they carried urgent news. Elias didn't need to guess what the message was. The tale of Tallulah Hayes and the bull had spread like prairie fire in July. Some folks called it a miracle. Others whispered words less kind, unnatural. Too much woman. No man left to lead if she's the one holding the rope. Elias heard it all, even in silence. When he ventured into town that afternoon for salt and lamp oil, the saloon door creaked open and spat laughter into the street. He caught the name Boone tangled in the chuckles. His ears burned, and for a moment he considered turning back. But Tallulah was walking beside him, carrying a basket as though the stares and whispers were no heavier than dust. Her stride did not falter. "Head high," she murmured, not unkindly. "Let them talk." Inside the general store, Mrs. Henderson stood by the counter with arms folded across her chest. Her roses had been trampled to ruin less than a day ago, yet her gaze softened as it landed on Tallulah. "Those beasts of yours," she began, her tone sharper than her eyes. "They need stronger fences." Then she paused, as if words she had planned were slipping from her grasp. "Still, I've never seen anyone calm Dakota like that. Not even Boone here." Elias's jaw tightened, but Tallulah only inclined her head. "Sometimes strength isn't in the rope," she said. "It's in knowing when not to pull it." The room hushed at the remark, and for a fleeting moment Elias thought he saw admiration flicker in Mrs. Henderson's stern face. Outside, the gossip mill spun faster. At the saloon, Silas Merrick, the traveling merchant with a tongue like a whip, lifted his whiskey glass and told the gathering crowd that Boone's new bride could wrestle a steer to its knees while her husband counted seeds in the garden. Each laugh rang like a nail hammered into Elias's pride. From the hitch rail, he could hear snippets big as a barn door. Poor Boone, drowned by his own mail-order bride. The bitterness sat in his stomach like raw copper. By evening, the trickle of neighbors turned into a steady flow. They arrived with flimsy excuses, thought you might need more nails, got extra biscuits, wondering if you'd share seed potatoes. But all eyes darted toward Tallulah. They lingered to watch as she drove fence posts with a sledgehammer, each swing ringing like judgment. The rhythm of her labor was as steady as church bells. Elias, stretched thin by the attention, busied himself with the wire, pulling and knotting with hands that shook more from shame than effort. Among the visitors came the Morrison clan. Samuel Morrison, broad as an oxen, twice as loud, leaned against the fence rail with his 3 strapping sons clustered behind him. His smile was practiced, but his eyes carried mockery. "Heard your lady's got away with livestock," he drawled, spitting into the dirt. "Reckon she don't need much help from the likes of us." His sons chuckled in unison, their boots scuffing dust into small clouds. Tallulah wiped sweat from her brow and swung the hammer again, the post sinking deeper with one blow than Elias could have managed in 3. Elias felt heat crawl up his neck. Morrison's words echoed the very doubts gnawing at him. Since her arrival was he enough? Could a man as slight as him hold respect? Standing beside a woman like her, grew up on a cattle ranch in Montana. Elias offered, forcing steadiness into his voice. "She knows her way with animals." The truth was, he'd only learned this fact that morning, as casually as one might mention the weather. Yet saying it out loud felt like both shield and surrender. The eldest Morrison boy, no more than 19 but built like a young bull, stepped forward. "Might be she'd like some help with that post hole," he said, puffing his chest. But Tallulah's answer was calm and clear. "I've got my rhythm now. Best you give your strength to Mr. Boone here with the wire." The boy stiffened, pride wounded. His brothers shifted, exchanging glances. Morrison himself only smirked, but Elias saw the calculations in his eyes the way some men measured worth by weight, by height, by muscle, and how Tallulah's presence toppled those scales. That night, after the visitors drifted away, Elias sat on the porch, shoulders slumped. The sky blazed with sunset fire. Clouds stretched thin like embers in ash. Crickets sang. A lonely fiddle wailed from town, and the smell of cut grass clung to the cooling air. Tallulah sat opposite him, quiet, the lamplight catching the tired lines around her eyes. The silence pressed heavy, filled with all the unspoken fears. Finally, she broke it, her voice low and worn. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" She did not look at him, only at the horizon, where the last light bled into night. Elias shifted in his chair, the wood groaning under him. "I should have said more in my letters," he admitted. He wanted to confess it, all the smallness he felt, the loneliness that drove him to write, the shame that clung to him like a second skin. But the words tangled in his throat. Tallulah drummed her fingers on the chair arm, slow and thoughtful. "Letters measure wishes," she said again, repeating the phrase she'd used when she first stepped into his cabin. But wishes never told the whole story. The evening wind slid across the porch, carrying the smell of sage and the faint copper tang of dust. Elias closed his eyes, hearing the laughter from the saloon still echo in his skull, hearing Morrison's drawl, feeling the sting of being weighed and found wanting. And yet he opened his eyes and looked at her. She hadn't mocked him. She hadn't flinched at his weakness. She had simply worked beside him, steady as a post driven deep into the ground. And for the first time, a thought stirred in him like a coal catching breath. Perhaps strength wore more than one face. The stars emerged, sharp and cold, as they sat together in the hush between words. The distance between them was not measured in feet, but in the unspoken bridge they might yet build. Twilight came to the valley like spilled honey, slow and golden, clinging to the edges of the cottonwoods before it slid into indigo. Elias Boone lit the oil lamp on the porch, the flame trembling in its chimney as the first crickets stitched their song into the cooling air. The boards beneath his boots creaked when he sank into his chair, a weary sound that seemed to echo the heaviness in his chest. Tallulah Hayes sat across from him, her long frame bent slightly as she unlaced her boots. Dust clung to the hem of her prairie skirt, and sweat still traced faint lines at her temples. She had worked all day without pause, splitting rails, hauling water, steadying Dakota when he flinched at a passing rider's whip crack. Elias had kept pace as best he could, his hands raw from pulling wire, his shoulders aching from strain. Yet beside her, he felt like a candle struggling to outshine the sun. The silence stretched between them, heavy as storm clouds. Only the cicadas filled it, their droning rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Elias stared out at the darkening horizon where the last streaks of light painted the mesa in bronze. His throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything that might steady the wobbling ground beneath him. Instead, Tallulah spoke first. Her voice was low, carrying a kind of tired honesty that left no room for pretense. "This isn't what either of us pictured, is it?" Elias's fingers tightened on the chair arm. He swallowed hard, then forced out, "No, it isn't." The words came rough, scraping the inside of his chest. He hesitated, then added, "When I wrote those letters, I thought maybe a woman would come who'd make me feel bigger, stronger, not smaller." Tallulah turned her head, her profile etched against the fading light. Her cheekbones were sharp, her jaw firm, but her eyes softened as they caught his. "And when I answered," she said slowly, "I thought maybe I'd find a man who'd see me as more than size, not a spectacle, not a contest." Her words pierced deeper than any neighbor's gossip. Elias lowered his gaze. "Ashamed. I should have said more in those letters," he murmured. "Should have told you that I'm not like the other men here, that most days I feel like I'm holding this place together with string and prayer." Tallulah's hands rested on her knees. In the lamplight, Elias noticed the tiny scars along her knuckles, proof of years spent working reins, lifting tools, carrying burdens. She exhaled, long and steady, as if weighing whether to share the truth folded deep inside her. Then she reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a square of cloth. It was a handkerchief, edges frayed, pale blue flowers stitched into one corner by a hand more delicate than hers. She held it gently, as though afraid it might vanish if grasped too tight. "My mother made this," she said. "When I was a girl, I carried it to church socials, to barn dances. Thought maybe it made me look more ladylike, but the boys only laughed. Said a big girl with a dainty kerchief looked like a bear wearing ribbons." Elias's chest tightened. He could almost see it, a younger Tallulah, shoulders already broad, clutching that little piece of beauty while enduring cruel laughter. She stared down at the cloth now, her voice softer. "I've spent most of my life trying to prove I'm not just a challenge for men to measure themselves against, that I can be something more, a partner, a woman worth gentleness." The cicadas seemed to hush, leaving only the quiet rasp of her confession. Elias drew a breath that caught in his throat. His own shame, his smallness, felt insignificant compared to the weight she carried every day. "You deserve that," he said finally, his voice rough but true. "Gentleness." She looked up, surprised, as though the word was rarely offered to her. For a moment, neither spoke. The night deepened, stars pinning themselves one by one into the dark cloth of the sky. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I feel like I'm not enough. Tallulah, not strong enough, not big enough, not man enough for this life. But today, when I saw you with Dakota, I realized strength isn't only muscle. It's steadiness, courage, care. You have that in ways I don't. Maybe I never will." Her eyes searched his face, and then she shook her head slightly. "And what I saw today was a man who worried more for me than his pride. Do you know how rare that is?" Elias blinked. He hadn't thought of it that way. All day he had carried the sting of whispers and Morrison's smirk, but hearing her say it, something inside him eased, like a rope untied. They fell quiet again. The breeze carried the smell of sagebrush and the faint tang of smoke from a neighbor's chimney. The porch boards were cool under their boots. Tallulah folded the handkerchief once more and slipped it back into her pocket, patting it like a secret kept safe. After a long silence, Elias whispered, "What do we do now?" She turned toward him fully, her expression softer than he'd yet seen it. "We try," she said. "We try to make something different, not the marriage people expect, but the kind we need." The words settled over Elias like a blanket against the chill. For the first time since her arrival, the weight of doubt lifted just enough for hope to breathe. He sat back, letting the stars draw a quiet canopy over them. The night stretched on, filled not with the ache of loneliness, but with the hum of possibility. And, though no promises were spoken, Something had shifted, two wounded souls beginning to recognize in each other the shape of healing. The following week carried with it the bite of early autumn. Morning smelled of frost along the grass, and the wind had a restless edge that rattled the corral gates. Elias Boone woke before dawn, as usual, but his chest was lighter than the mornings before. Tallulah Hayes had stayed despite the whispers, despite the sideways glances of men like Morrison. More than that, she had shared truths with him that few women would dare utter aloud, and in her honesty, Elias felt something forming between them, fragile but steady, like the first beams of a cabin raised on raw land. That sense of fragile peace shattered one afternoon. The sun burned high, bleaching the sky white. Elias was mending a gate with Tallulah when a scream ripped through the valley, the kind of scream that freezes marrow. Both froze, heads snapping toward the sound. Down near the creek, Mrs. Henderson's youngest grandson had been thrown from his pony. Elias's stomach lurched when he spotted the boy sprawled in the shallow ravine, his small form frighteningly still. The horse above him danced in panic, hooves striking dangerously close. Without thinking, Elias bolted. His boots tore through the weeds, lungs searing, his hat falling somewhere behind him. He heard Tallulah shout his name, but he did not slow. The boy lay half-crushed under the pony's weight, and instinct raw, uncalculated drove Elias forward. He threw himself down beside the animal, grasping its bridle with both hands. The terrified beast reared, nearly knocking him senseless. Its hooves slashed the air, a thunder of iron that could have split his skull. Still, Elias clung, dragging with every ounce of wiry strength he possessed. "Hold him steady!" Tallulah's voice boomed as she sprinted down the slope, her skirt catching on briars. In one motion, she seized the animal's flank, using her height and raw power to shove the horse sideways. The ground shook as she levered the animal off the boy's body. Elias, gasping, pulled the boy free, cradling his limp shoulders. Dust and blood smeared his shirt as he pressed a trembling hand against the child's cheek. The boy coughed a weak, broken sound, but life nonetheless. Relief slammed into Elias so hard it brought tears. He looked up and saw Tallulah, sweat streaming, her arms still braced against the quivering horse. She was a fortress in that moment, a mountain of strength. And yet, in her eyes, he saw fear not for herself, but for him and the boy. Neighbors had gathered by then, drawn by the commotion. They stood in stunned silence, watching Elias kneel in the dirt, rocking the boy gently, whispering encouragement through his ragged breaths. "You're safe now, lad, you're safe," Elias repeated, though his own voice shook. When the boy's father rushed forward, falling to his knees in gratitude, Elias staggered back, exhaustion washing through him. His arms trembled from the effort of holding the horse and lifting the child. His shirt clung with sweat. For a brief, piercing moment, he realized he had not thought of Morrison or the town's scorn, nor his own smallness. He had simply acted. Tallulah approached, her chest heaving, dust clinging to her hair. She looked at Elias with something raw and unguarded. Admiration, respect, and perhaps tenderness. She placed a hand large, steady on his shoulder. "You risked your life," she said. "I couldn't stand still." He replied, voice hoarse. That boy needed someone. The words, simple as they were, struck deeper than any sermon. Around them, the neighbors exchanged glances. The rancher they once mocked as too slight, too timid, had leapt toward danger without thought of himself. And the towering woman they whispered about had saved horse and child alike with fearless strength. Together, they had turned what could have been tragedy into deliverance. By sundown, word of the rescue was already coursing through town, faster than whiskey poured down a dry throat. At the saloon, men retold the tale with wide eyes. Some focused on Tallulah's power, but more and more spoke of Elias's courage. Women whispered of how he had cradled the boy with gentleness not all men could summon. The balance of rumor shifted. That night, back at the ranch, the weight of the day settled on Elias. He sat on the porch steps, arms draped across his knees, staring at the moon rising over the mesas. His body ached with bruises he hadn't noticed in the rush, but a different ache filled him, an ache of possibility. Tallulah came out carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. She lowered herself beside him, her size filling the narrow space. Yet her presence felt less overwhelming now. She handed him a cup, her fingers brushing his in the dark. "You were brave," she said quietly. He shook his head. "I was foolish. That horse could have killed me. But you didn't hesitate," she countered. "Do you know how rare that is? Most men would have stood back, calculating their pride, weighing their strength. You only thought of the boy." Her words loosened something locked tight inside Elias. He turned to her, the lamplight from the window casting her face in soft gold. He saw the curve of her smile, tired yet radiant, and the shadows in her eyes that longed to be seen as more than might and muscle. "I thought today showed me how weak I was," he confessed. "I could barely hold that horse. But then I realized strength isn't only in arms. Sometimes it's just in not turning away." Tallulah reached across the space, laying her calloused hand over his. The gesture was gentle, careful, as though she feared breaking the moment. "And sometimes strength is letting another carry the weight beside you," she whispered. They sat like that, the night cool around them, the land hushed after its turmoil. Elias felt the pulse of his heart steady under her hand, and for the first time he did not measure himself against her size, nor shrink from the comparison. Instead, he saw them as halves of something whole, his quiet courage, her unshakable might. Above them, the stars spread endless and clear, as if the heavens themselves bore witness. In that silence, something unspoken was forged between them, stronger than any fence post, brighter than any rumor could dim. The ranch would never be the same, neither would they. The night after the accident lingered in Elias Boone's bones. Every muscle ached, every bruise sang when he moved. Yet beneath the soreness lived something warmer, a quiet pride that he had not run. Still, doubt clung to him like the dust that never truly washed away. Could one brave moment outweigh a lifetime of feeling smaller than every man in town? That evening, the sky unfurled wide and sharp, the stars bright as hammered nails. A pale moon climbed over the mesas, painting the land silver. Elias sat on the porch rail, turning the small wooden ring box in his hands. He had carved it months ago, whittling late into the night while coyotes sang in the distance. Each stroke of his knife had been a prayer for companionship. Yet now, faced with Tallulah Hayes, he wondered if the ring was too small for her hand, too small for the life they were already building together. Tallulah came outside, the lantern light brushing across her broad shoulders and the loose strands of hair escaping her braid. She carried no hammer, no rope, only a shawl she draped over her shoulders against the cool night. She paused at the edge of the porch, studying him. "You've been quiet all day," she said softly. Elias looked down at the box. "I've been thinking." About what he swallowed, his throat dry. About us. About whether this was ever real to begin with, or just words on paper. Arrangements made by two lonely people. Tallulah stepped closer, her boots whispering against the planks. "Do you regret it?" His chest tightened. He shook his head. "No, I don't regret you. I only regret the things I never told you before you came. The truth of me." She studied him in silence. Then, with surprising gentleness, she sat beside him. The boards groaned under their weight. The night air smelled of sage and wood smoke drifting from a neighbor's chimney. "I've carried regrets, too," she admitted. "All my life men looked at me and saw either a challenge or a jest. Not one ever saw me as a woman who wanted tenderness. When I wrote those letters, I just hoped you'd be different. And today, when you ran toward that boy instead of away, I saw the truth of you." Elias's fingers shook as he opened the box. Inside lay the ring, a simple band carved from oak, smooth and gleaming under the moonlight. "I made this the day after your first letter arrived," he confessed. "But I carved it for the woman I imagined, not the one I came to know. It's too small." His voice cracked. "Just like me." Tallulah's breath caught. She reached for the ring and slid it over her finger. It stuck halfway, just as he feared. But instead of disappointment, a smile softened her face. "Do you know what I see?" she asked. What his voice barely carried. "I see a man who spent 3 months shaping hope out of wood. A man who believed enough to make something with his own hands. Rings can be resized, Elias. But a heart that believes." She tapped the ring gently. "That's rarer than gold." The words washed over him, loosening the knot inside his chest. For the first time, he dared to meet her gaze fully. There was no ridicule there, no pity, only a steady warmth that made his ribs ache with something like joy. Tallulah slipped the ring back into his palm. "Ask me," she said, voice firm but tender. "Ask me not because a letter bound us, or because folks expect it. Ask me because you want to." Elias's hands trembled, but his heart steadied. He dropped to one knee on the porch boards, the wood cool against his trousers. The night seemed to hush the crickets, the distant owls, even the whisper of wind as if waiting. "Tallulah Hayes," he said, his voice clear now, rising with every word. "Will you marry me, not out of duty, not out of loneliness, but because together we might build something better than either of us alone, a life of strength and gentleness, side by side?" Her eyes glistened in the moonlight. For a moment she only looked at him, her chest rising with a breath that carried years of longing. Then she smiled a smile so genuine it remade her whole face. "Yes," she whispered, "but with conditions." Elias blinked, startled. "Conditions?" She laughed softly, the sound low and warm. "I want us to resize this ring together. I want you to teach me how to carve wood, and I'll teach you how to gentle a horse. I want to share burdens not to prove who's stronger, but to prove that together we're enough." Relief surged through him, almost dizzying. He rose, clutching her hands in his. "All of it," he said fiercely. "I'd like all of it." They stood close, close enough that he could smell the faint salt of her skin, feel the steadiness of her breath. Above them, the stars wheeled bright and ancient. Around them, the land held its breath. And in that quiet, Elias Boone and Tallulah Hayes sealed a promise not just of marriage, but of a life forged in mutual strength, carved out of both tenderness and grit. Later, when they sat together wrapped in the shawl, Elias felt something he hadn't known in years. Peace. He realized that healing had begun not just for him, but for her, too. They were no longer two misfits thrown together by loneliness, but two souls brave enough to try. And as the night deepened, the stars seemed to burn brighter, as if blessing the vow that would soon become spoken before the town. 6 months passed, and the land turned from the brittle browns of late summer to the rich golds and crimsons of fall. Cottonwood leaves fluttered down like coins from heaven, carpeting the ground in color. The Boone Ranch, once regarded by neighbors as a lonely man's failing gamble, now pulsed with new life. Rows of vegetables grew straighter, fence posts stood firmer, and cattle grazed calmly within sturdier rails. People whispered less of Elias Boone and Tallulah Hayes as curiosities, and more as a pair worth watching. The morning of their wedding dawned crisp, the valley air tinged with wood smoke and frost. Elias dressed with trembling fingers in a clean but worn shirt, the fabric scrubbed, nearly threadbare from Tallulah's careful washing. In his vest pocket lay the oak ring now widened, reshaped by both their hands. He had carved the band anew, while she sanded and smoothed until the wood gleamed like amber in the sun. Beside it sat a second ring, one she had fashioned for him from hickory. When he first slipped it on, the fit had been perfect, as if her large, steady hands knew his measure better than he ever had himself. The little clapboard church sat at the edge of town, its white paint fading, its bell rope frayed. Yet that morning, it seemed radiant, sunlight pouring through its small windows like benediction. Neighbors filled the pews, men tugging nervously at collars, women whispering behind gloves. The very same tongues that once wagged with cruelty now buzzed with anticipation. Even Mrs. Henderson, once furious over her ruined roses, had brought a clay pot with fresh-cut blooms, setting them at the altar like an olive branch. Elias entered first, his steps hesitant but determined. He felt every eye on him, weighing him as they always had. But today, instead of shrinking, he carried Tallulah's words in his heart rings can be resized, but character cannot. That thought straightened his shoulders. Then she appeared. Tallulah walked down the aisle in a prairie dress of soft cream, its simple lines more radiant than any finery. Her hair was bound loosely, a few strands framing her strong, handsome face. She carried no bouquet, only the little blue handkerchief her mother had once stitched, folded neatly in her palm. Gasps fluttered through the congregation, not in mockery, but in awe. For once, her size was not whispered about as spectacle, it was seen as grace. as presence, as undeniable beauty. Elias's breath caught. Every doubt he had carried seemed to scatter like dust in the wind. When her eyes found his, he saw no judgment, only warmth and something deeper trust. The preacher's words were simple. He spoke of partnership, of burdens lightened when shared, of love that healed wounds carved by solitude. As Elias repeated the vows, his voice steadied with each word to honor, to cherish, to share strength and gentleness alike. When he slid the oak ring onto her finger, it fit snugly, perfectly, as though it had always been meant for her. Tallulah's vow was quieter, but no less powerful. To walk beside you, never ahead nor behind, to see you not for what the town says you are, but for who I know you to be. When she placed the hickory ring on his hand, Elias felt more whole than he had ever dared to hope. For a heartbeat, silence filled the church silence, thick with something reverent. Then the congregation erupted in applause, clapping that rattled the rafters, cheers that spilled out into the street. Even Samuel Morrison, who had once mocked Elias, nodded with something close to respect. Perhaps he had seen, as all of them had, that strength came in many forms, and that the Boone rancher had found his. Afterward, neighbors gathered at the ranch for a meal. Pies, roasted meats, and loaves of bread crowded the tables. Children ran in the yard, their laughter ringing louder than the chickens' clucks. Dakota, confined within his reinforced corral, snorted but remained calm, as if he too understood that the world had changed. Elias moved among the guests, greeting each with quiet gratitude. Many still looked more at Tallulah than at him, but the gazes were no longer cruel. They were curious, even admiring. And when Tallulah bent to show a child how to feed a calf from a bucket, laughter on her lips, Elias felt a surge of pride so fierce it made his eyes sting. As the sun dipped low, painting the land in a copper glow, Elias and Tallulah slipped away from the crowd. They stood together at the fence line, watching the cattle move like dark shadows across the grass. Elias reached for her hand, large, calloused, warm, and laced his fingers with hers. "Do you realize," he murmured, "that we've turned whispers into respect?" She tilted her head, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Respect fades. What matters is what we build here, with our hands, with our hearts." Elias squeezed her hand, feeling the hickory ring press steady against his skin. For once, he didn't feel small. He felt grounded, anchored, whole. Behind them, the laughter of neighbors and the glow of lanterns spilled across the yard. Before them, the vast plains stretched into twilight, endless and waiting. Their life together would not be easy. Storms would still come. Winters still bite, but they would meet it side by side. And in that quiet moment, under the deepening sky, Elias Boone and Tallulah Hayes knew they had found something greater than the arrangement of letters and hopes that had first bound them. They had found true partnership love not measured by size or strength, but by the courage to truly see one another exactly as they were. The story of Elias Boone and Tallulah Hayes does not end with a wedding day or with the applause of neighbors fading into the valley night. In truth, their story was never about spectacle or approval. It was about healing, the kind of quiet mending that happens when two weary souls dare to lay down their burdens and trust another to carry them together. For Elias, life had long been measured in shortages too short, too slight, too little to be counted by the world's rough scales. Yet through Tallulah's eyes, he discovered that courage is not measured in inches or muscle, but in the willingness to step forward when fear screams to step back. His dash into danger for a fallen boy, his trembling honesty on the porch, these were acts of strength, as true as any man swinging a hammer. For Tallulah, the years had been a litany of cruel laughter and sideways glances. Men saw her as a challenge to best, women as a curiosity to whisper about. But in Elias's gaze, she found no need to prove herself, no contest to win. Instead, she was seen for the first time as a woman with tenderness to give, with gentleness hidden behind calloused hands. And in his care, clumsy though it was, she found the acceptance she had long craved. Together, they learned that love is not born from perfection. It grows from patience, from shared labor, from the daily choice to stay when walking away might be easier. They patched fences side by side, mended gardens with laughter, weathered storms with one another's strength, and slowly, the town that once whispered began to watch. Respect bloomed not because of spectacle, but because of the steady, ordinary faithfulness of two people who refused to let loneliness define them. This tale leaves us with a truth as steady as the mountains on the horizon. The heart's worth is not measured by size, shape, or by how loudly the world applauds. It is measured by the quiet courage to love, even when fear says you are not enough. It is measured by the gentleness to see another soul not for what the world calls them, but for who they truly are. So, dear listener, as you close this story tonight, I invite you to pause and ask yourself, where in your life do you measure yourself by scales that were never fair to begin with? Who in your world might be waiting to be seen, not for their strength or their scars, but for their heart? If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what part of Elias and Tallulah's journey spoke to you the most. And if you want more tales of healing, courage, and love born in the dust of the old frontier, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your voice, your presence here, means more than you know. Because just like Elias and Tallulah discovered, none of us are meant to walk alone.